What's going on, guys? Welcome to Wicked and Wild, where we cover all types of true crime, whether solved or unsolved, terrifying or tragic, or just plain wicked and wild. I'm your host, Tyler, here to give you exactly what you came for. And with that being said, let's jump right into it. Today's case brings us to the great state of Utah, where we find the happy family of four parents Josh and Susan Powell, and their two young children, Charles and Braden. But the happiness that once surrounded this God-fearing family would quickly become engulfed with tragedy and reveal an outcome so horrific that you'll be left with more questions than answers. Susan Cox Powell was born on October 16, 1981, in Oregon to parents Chuck and Judy Cox. She was the second of four siblings and spent much of her childhood in Puyallup, Washington. Susan's parents were devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and their faith played a significant role in Susan's upbringing. As a child, Susan was a bubbly, outgoing, and fun-loving girl. She was an active participant in her church's youth group and enjoyed outdoor activities like camping and hiking with her family. In her early teens, Susan and her family moved to Utah, where she then attended high school and eventually university. Susan's teenage years were marked by some difficult experiences. She reportedly struggled with her weight and body image and was diagnosed with bulimia. She also endured sexual harassment from a male neighbor, which her family says was not taken seriously by local authorities. Despite some of Susan's traumatic and unfortunate events in her life, her classmates described her as being kind and friendly to everyone, and always having a smile on her face. Fast forward later to when 20-year-old Susan had first met her future husband Josh Powell at a church social event in 2000. The event was reportedly a potluck dinner held at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Puyallup, Washington, where both Susan and Josh were attending at the time. It's said that Josh caught Susan's attention when he first offered to help her carry a large dish of food into the event, where the two would strike up a conversation and reportedly hit it off right away. They soon began dating and shortly after got engaged in 2001, marrying later that same year. At the time of their engagement, Susan was attending Brigham Young University in Utah, later graduating in 2003 with an impressive 3.79 GPA, while Josh was working as an insurance claim adjuster in Washington. Despite the distance between them, they managed to maintain their relationship, with Susan eventually moving to Washington to be with Josh after they got married, and for a time, their love appeared to be strong. Susan's sister, Denise Cox, described the couple as happy, holding hands, hugging, and always kissing each other during the early days of their marriage. So how does a young, God-fearing couple like Josh and Susan go from being a young, in love, and happy couple to a massive tragedy that would devastate everybody? Well, for that answer, we need to look closer at Josh and his upbringing to see who it is that Susan really married. Josh Powell was born on January 20th, 1976 to Stephen and Tarika Powell in Puyallup, Washington. Josh's parents had a dysfunctional marriage, to say the least, mostly caused by Josh's father's violent abuse of his family and his disaffection with the LDS Church. According to divorce filings by Tarika, Josh's mom, Josh's father Stephen showed Josh and his two brothers pornography when they were young and refused to teach or enforce limits on certain behaviors. Josh allegedly had many problems during his teenage years. As a teenager, Josh allegedly killed gerbils belonging to one of his sisters and even threatened his mother with a butcher knife. He also attempted suicide on at least one known occasion. In the late 1990s, Josh was living in Seattle as a student at the University of Washington, and it was here he began a relationship with a young woman named Catherine Everett, and both would move into an apartment together. This relationship wouldn't last long, with Catherine commenting that Josh was insanely controlling, having limitations and rules when it came to her family, and that she couldn't go anywhere without him being present. This relationship would come to an end when she snuck to visit a friend in Utah and broke up with Josh over the phone for her safety. Now fast forward to after Josh and Susan's marriage in 2001. Susan wanted to be closer to Josh and decided to move into his father's home in South Hill, Washington. At first, everything seemed to be going great, both in the marriage and in their temporary living situation. But unknown to Susan, Josh's father, Stephen, had developed an obsessive infatuation with her, which was only inflamed by their close proximity. Stephen followed Susan around the house with a camcorder, used a small mirror to spy on her while she used the bathroom, stole underwear from her laundry, read her journals, and even posted love songs online under a disguised account.
Susan has been feeling ill. She had a cold, and I offered to rub her feet, to rub her toes, to give her some stimulation.
In 2003, Stephen confessed his intense and very creepy feelings to a stunned Susan, who rejected him, and Josh and Susan moved out of state to West Valley City, Utah soon after, partially so Susan could distance herself from Josh's very creepy father. In 2005, Susan and Josh would go on to have their first son, Charles, followed by their second son 2 years later, Braden, born in 2007. Their marriage was noted by both Susan and Josh's parents to be very happy and loving. And these statements would be true until their marriage would hit rock bottom in 2008. By then, the couple would be non-stop fighting, including in front of the children, with Josh showing extreme control over Susan. Despite facing challenges in her marriage to Josh, Susan was said to have been a devoted and loving mother who would do anything for her children. Susan had confided in friends and family about her unhappy marriage and concerns about Josh's behavior. Through journal entries and emails sent by Susan, it was clear that a big part of the tension came from Josh's refusal to attend church services with his family, and over his continued contact with his father, despite his father's ongoing advances towards Susan. Another big reason being lack of intimacy on Josh's end, and even growing fear for her and her children's safety. In fact, Susan had even gone so far as to write in her personal journals that she feared for her and her children's lives. 1 year after claiming that their marriage had hit rock bottom, the dreaded day came, December 6, 2009, where Susan, Joshua, and their kids were reported missing by family members. Susan's parents called police after not being able to find the family at home. They also checked with their employers, and neither Susan nor Josh went to work Monday. Josh and his 2 children, aged 4 and 1, would return to their home on Tuesday. Upon returning, Josh claimed that he had taken their 2 young sons on a camping trip in the middle of the night, and when he returned the next day, his wife was gone. Josh's claim of going camping with his sons while his wife went missing was immediately suspicious to law enforcement officials, who launched an investigation into her disappearance. Josh was named as a person of interest in the case and was subjected to intense scrutiny by both law enforcement and the media. But this investigation wouldn't be over soon, and sadly would drag on for years, leaving Susan's family wondering what happened, and Susan's children not knowing exactly what happened to their mother. Despite Josh's insistence that he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance, his behavior in the aftermath of her disappearance raised several red flags. Initially, he refused to cooperate with the investigation, hired an attorney, and eventually moved out of state with his children 2 years later in 2011 to Washington, apparently to be closer to Susan's family. One aspect of Josh's behavior that has puzzled investigators and armchair detectives alike is his decision to take his sons camping in the middle of the night during a snowstorm. Was this a deliberate attempt to create an alibi or cover up evidence related to Susan's disappearance? No one can say for certain, but what we do know is that Josh's actions that night have raised many questions and even more suspicions. Michael Powell, Josh's younger brother, was considered a suspect due to his suspicious behavior around the time of Susan's disappearance. After Susan went missing, Michael drove from his home in Washington to Utah to help his brother with the investigation. However, things quickly took a strange turn. Michael refused to cooperate with police and became increasingly hostile and uncooperative. Now, this behavior raised a lot of red flags with investigators and made Michael a person of interest in the case. But then, Without any explanation, Michael abruptly left Utah. It wasn't entirely clear why he left at first. Some speculate that his departure was related to a search of his father's home, where evidence related to the investigation was seized. During the investigation into Josh, evidence was presented that his father, Steve, had been secretly filming Susan and other women in his bathroom for several years. Steve was convicted of voyeurism in 2012 and would serve a 30-month sentence. The trial court, though finding thousands of pictures on Steve's computer of child pornography, had dismissed the charge of possession of child pornography in 2012. But the State Court of Appeals reinstated the charge in 2014. He was then convicted of the crime in 2015 and released from prison in July of 2017 after serving another 2 years. However, Steve's creepy behavior and obsession with Susan didn't end there. After Susan's disappearance, investigators discovered more photographs of her in Steve's possession and found matching DNA on a comforter that was seized from his home. These discoveries raised suspicions that he may have been involved in Susan's disappearance, or at least had knowledge of what had happened to her. Despite these accusations, Steve consistently denied any involvement and was never charged in connection with the case. Josh had been investigated by police many times now, and each time he would become more and more suspicious. During one interview, Josh's behavior was incredibly bizarre, and his answers were evasive and nonsensical. In fact, many people who have watched the footage have speculated that Josh was heavily under the influence of drugs, or perhaps even suffering from some kind of mental illness. During the interview, Josh refused to answer many of the questions posed to him by investigators, instead choosing to babble incoherently and make odd comments about everything from his missing wife to the weather outside. To make matters worse, he appeared to be sweating profusely and seemed to be struggling to focus on the conversation at hand. Another time he was interviewed by police in the aftermath of Susan's disappearance, Josh's stories about where he and his sons were on the night of her disappearance kept changing. The cops were left scratching their heads as they tried to piece together his unreliable accounts. And just when they thought they had a lead, he would change his story again. Eventually, Josh claimed that he had taken his sons camping in a remote area of Utah's West Desert, but no evidence was ever found to support his story. It's clear that Josh was trying to hide something. But what exactly? During an early interview, when cops brought up the life insurance claim he made on Susan just 2 months prior to her disappearance, Josh claimed that the life insurance policy was simply a routine financial decision, and that he had been advised to do so by his attorney. Josh had taken out a whopping $1.5 million life insurance policy on Susan, and of course, naming himself as the sole beneficiary. But given the mounting evidence against him, few were convinced by his explanation. Leading up to Susan's disappearance, there were several concerning signs that Josh was on the brink of doing something drastic. He withdrew a large sum of money from his bank account, donated his son's toys to charity, and even sent out several cryptic emails to family members that appeared to be a suicide note. Following the disappearance of Susan, Josh was the sole custodian of their 2 young sons. However, in the months and years that followed, concerns about the boys' safety and well-being were being raised by Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy, as well as by law enforcement officials and others involved in the case. In September 2011, a Washington state court awarded temporary custody of the boys to Susan's parents, citing concerns about Josh's mental health and his ongoing hostility towards the Cox family. The court also ordered Josh to undergo a psychological evaluation and to participate in therapy. However, in February 2012, 5 months after Susan's parents were awarded temporary custody of the children, a Utah court granted Josh supervised visitation with his kids, despite concerns about his mental health and the fact that he was still a person of interest in his wife's disappearance. And just days later, on February 5th, 2012, Josh would do something so drastic and evil that it would shock the entire nation. A social worker had accompanied the children to Josh's home for one of those supervised visits. But what was meant to be a routine visit turned into a horrifying tragedy. Josh was waiting at the door and yelled to his children that he had a surprise for them. And the 2 young children, being excited, ran to their father and inside the home. Once the boys were inside, Josh looked the social worker right in her eyes and shut the door, locking it behind him. The social worker, realizing that she was now locked outside by Josh, immediately called 911 to report what just happened. The social worker gave the address to the dispatcher and continuously begging him to send help immediately, for Josh was unpredictable and the prime suspect of his wife's disappearance. The dispatcher did not take the social worker's pleas for help seriously.
Hey, I'm on a supervised visitation for a court-ordered visit, and something really weird has happened. The kids went into the house, and the parent, the biological parent, whose name is Josh Powell, will not let me in the door. What should I do?
What's the address?
It's 8119, and I think it's 89. I don't know what the address is.
Okay, that's pretty important for me to know.
But I think I need help right away. He's on a very short lease with CSHS, and CPS has been involved. And this is the craziest thing. He looked right at me and closed the door. Are you there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm just waiting to know where you are.
While the very ignorant dispatcher was explaining how other callers needed police assistance more than she did, the social worker began to smell gasoline. And that's when the situation became much more frightening. The social worker began frantically pleading with the dispatcher about the seriousness of the situation. But unfortunately, the dispatcher wouldn't send for help until 8 minutes after the call had first started. And by then, it was too late. Moments before the dispatcher would even call for assistance, the house would explode and be completely engulfed in flames as the panicked social worker was still on the phone with 911, but now completely screaming and terrified. The police wouldn't arrive on the scene until an additional 13 minutes later, making it a whopping 22 minutes in total for when the social worker first called 911. By that time, it was impossible to enter the burning house due to the intense flames and smoke. And when the fire was finally extinguished, the bodies of Josh and, unfortunately, his 2 sons were found deceased inside. An autopsy later determined that both boys died of smoke inhalation, and Josh died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Official reports suggest that Josh attacked his own 2 sons, Charlie and Braden, with a hatchet before setting his house on fire. The hatchet wounds on the boys were not fatal, but were likely inflicted in an attempt to incapacitate them before the house was set on fire. It's a horrific act that begs the question, why would anyone do such a thing? Well, investigators have speculated that Josh may have been trying to cover up his role in the disappearance of his wife Susan. By eliminating his 2 young sons and himself, he may have thought that he could avoid further investigation or potential charges related to Susan's disappearance. Of course, we may never know for certain what was going through Josh's mind when he committed this unspeakable act, but one thing is very clear. The impact of this tragedy on Susan's family and the community is immeasurable. Even though Josh's secrets died with him that day, the investigation into her disappearance continues. As for Josh's brother Michael, this situation proved to be even more destructive. Despite initially denying any involvement, Michael had begun to make incriminating statements to friends and family members, suggesting he may have known more than he originally let on. About a year after the death of Josh and his 2 boys, Michael left his home in Puyallup, Washington, and informed his family that he was going camping. However, he would never return, and later that day would jump from a building in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Investigators found several items related to Susan's disappearance in Michael's van, including maps of Utah and Nevada, a gas can, and empty prescription medication bottles. The tragic end of Michael's life highlights the devastating impact that unresolved cases and public scrutiny can have on those involved. As for Josh's father, Steve Powell, he would be released from prison in 2017, but would pass away from heart failure just 1 year later. Some experts think that Josh Powell had a mental illness like depression or bipolar disorder that contributed to his violent behavior. Others have pointed out his history of being controlling and abusive towards Susan as a possible motive for his actions. In the end, we may never fully understand why Josh chose to take the lives of his innocent sons, himself, and potentially his wife. The tragic event left a profound impact on Susan's family and the community, and the investigation into her disappearance will continue to move forward. Despite countless investigations and searches, Susan's fate and whereabouts remain unknown, leaving her loved ones to grapple with the unending uncertainty. This haunting mystery continues to capture the attention of true crime fans around the world, as we all hope for a breakthrough in the search for Susan Cox Powell. Until then, her story stands as a stark reminder of the inexplicable and unexpected ways that tragedy can strike, and that the ones closest to you can hurt you the most. Any case that involves children dying, especially at the hands of their parents or parent, is always a hard one to cover. I don't understand how such evil can even exist in this world. Cases like this will always be the hardest to cover. Kids are innocent, and especially being hurt at the hands of their father, the one that's supposed to protect them, is just an evil twist that should only be in movies. But unfortunately, evil is very real, and the ones closest to you can really hurt you the most. With that being said, I hope you guys really enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'm sorry if you can hear I'm a little stuffy, but by next week I should be all cleared out and ready for the next one. So, with that being said again, it's time to get out of here. I'll see you guys next week. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.